Mary Queen of Scots led a life that was anything but dull. Queen of Scotland, aged just 6 days old, she would eventually become the Queen of France, then return to her native homeland to take up the crown that had been hers almost from the day of her birth. In this week's episode of the Tudor Chess podcast, I chat to Dr. Sarah Morris, known to many of you as the Tudor Travel Guide. And Sarah also happens to be my co-director on Simply Tudor Tours, our historic tour company that we set up together in 2024. Our May 2026 tour explores Mary's life, and so today Sarah and I discuss the many different palaces and castles that she inhabited, from the imposing medieval Stirling Castle to the Renaissance Palace of Holyroodhouse, which remains the official Scottish residence of the monarch to this day. Welcome back to the Tudor Chess podcast, episode 86, Mary, Queen of Scots, From Crown to Captivity, with Dr. Sarah Morris. Welcome to the Tudor Chess podcast, Dr. Sarah Morris. How are you?
I'm fine, Adam. Thank you so much for having me back. I'm losing count. Very privileged.
I genuinely think you probably talk to me more than you talk to your husband.
I think that's probably true. We do have a very intimate relationship, but, you know, it's all purely professional.
All purely professional, yes. And we're here today to have a chat, really, more than a sort of pure podcast, to have a talk about Mary, Queen of Scots, but more specifically the aspects of her life and the places that she spent time when she was young, when she was queen in Scotland, because we've, as people may or may not know, you and I co-run a historic tour company, and we've just launched our May 2026 tour, Mary Queen of Scots, From Crown to Captivity, which I'm very excited about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's out there. I mean, I think we're both lovers of Mary Queen of Scots, but I think it's also fair to say we're not quite as familiar with her story as we are, for example, with Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII and all of his wives. So I think we're passionate. We're going to be passionate about learning about some of these places ourselves. And that's why we've got so many fantastic experts joining us along the way, which perhaps we could touch on while we're talking.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely my knowledge, unlike you, where your knowledge of the venues, the buildings is second to none. But before we get into that, just a few questions, a few icebreakers. You've been on the podcast before, so people should know who you are. But just in case, could you provide me with a brief introduction into your background?
Yes, I'm Dr. Sarah Morris, and I've had a very interesting career that's taken me through being a medical doctor, a career in the pharmaceutical industry and in headhunting before in 2010, I started writing my first historical novel, Le Temps Viendra, a novel of Anne Boleyn, and one thing led to another. And I ended up writing another couple of books, 2 in the footsteps books, one in the footsteps of Anne Boleyn and the other in the footsteps of the Six Wives, which I co-authored with Natalie Bruniger. And then in 2018, I decided to bring all my love of Tudor history and writing together, and I founded the Tudor Travel Guide. So that's really, yes, and one thing has continued to lead to another. And one of those things, of course, has been our friendship and our partnership and the founding of Simply Tudor Tours.
Yes, it all started at an event at Hever Castle, if memory serves. We met at the 500th anniversary of the Chateau Vert event that we both went to at Hever.
We did indeed.
Yes. So your passion has always been about the buildings. It's the venues, the places that the Tudors inhabited. So where did that passion for, I suppose, the buildings maybe over the people, where did that really take root?
I think my parents had a lot to blame in the nicest possible way, dragging me around every historic house in the north of England. And of course, if we went on holiday anywhere in England, the first place we went to were the local heritage properties. So I loved the buildings. But I think actually it really came to fruition through the writing of the novel about Anne Boleyn, because I like hopefully any good fiction writer, I did a lot of research to try and educate myself about the finer details of life Tudor England. And part of that was really getting to understand and become familiar with the layout of the key places that were associated with Anne Boleyn's life. And so it's no joke to say that I could probably metaphorically lead you by the hand through the entirety of Greenwich Palace, because I spent hours poring over floor plans and reading books by the likes of Simon Thurley to try and reimagine these spaces and make them as realistic as possible. And that really solidified this union of people, events, and places. So, this is really exemplified by, this phrase that I often turn to: it's only time and not space that separates us from the past. It's the ability to stand in a space and just feel the history. And I just believe that the best way to encounter any history, but we're talking about Tudor history, is to go and visit a building and touch the walls and look around you. And it really brings the people and the stories to life in a way that I think is just not possible if you're reading from a book.
Yeah. And also, there are so many instances where people could be blithely unaware of actually what they're standing in. And we've had that several times. And, when you and I went to Windsor for the very first time, I had no idea that we were in the room where Anne Boleyn was made Marquess of Pembroke, until you were like, by the way, because so much of the Tudor stuff now in many places has been covered over, but actually all still, the physical space still exists.
Honestly, you were excited. Can you imagine my excitement when I first I had a map of modern day Windsor and a floor plan of the Tudor building. And I was studying each chamber bit by bit. And it suddenly dawned on me that the Garter throne room used to be Henry VIII's presence chamber. I nearly fell off my chair. I was so excited. And I remember going to Windsor the first time I actually went, having actually kind of made this connection. And I'd never read anybody talk about it in any of the other Tudor books or podcasts or whatever. So I remember walking into the room and wanting to kind of grab the nearest person and go, what happened here?
Yeah.
I just had to stand there in my own little bubble of excitement.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because the Windsor is so old. I mean, we're talking 1,000+ years or so, but we just, it's so now, we so think of it as part of modern day royal life. We forget that it has this remarkable history.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You just got to know what to look for.
Yeah.
And that's where we come in. Trying to take people to these places and bring them alive so that they can let their imagination go wild and just enjoy the stories that they're so familiar with, but from a different perspective.
On that note, this is a question I just wouldn't know the answer to, but I'm sure you do. Is there a lost Scottish palace or castle that you would like? I know, for example, if you had your chance, you'd bring Whitehall up from the grounds. But is there a Scottish equivalent to that you'd love to see that we don't have any version of?
I don't know about, look, there are just so many castles in Scotland. And I'm going to hold my hands up here and say that my most recent trip was just after lockdown. I was specifically going to look at some of the key places associated with Mary, Queen of Scots, which are the big places, some of which we'll talk about today, the likes of Linlithgow and Stirling and so on and so forth. And actually, all the ones I went to see are still standing to some degree or another. I suppose the one I'd like to see more of might be the one on Loch Leven. We have ruins on Loch Leven, but it's such a dramatic, such dramatic events took place there. I'd love to see the complete building and to be able to say, this was definitely the room in which she miscarried twins, or this was definitely the room in which she was forced to abdicate. We have a tower block, and she was likely in that tower block, but I think there's a bit more to Loch Leven, and I'd love to see more of that. But hey, there's probably other castles around, Scotland and abbeys that Mary visited, because she travelled extensively across Scotland. And I feel that I've only just scratched the surface, really.
Well, if you could also jump in a time travel machine and go back and ask Mary, Queen of Scots, one question, what would it be?
It's more like, what were you thinking?
Yes. I don't know whether you saw a few weeks ago, Tracy Borman was on the History Rage podcast, and that was pretty much Tracy's whole thing was, why were you so foolish?
Why? Why? I tell you what, I'm going to give credit to somebody on my Instagram account the other day who raised a couple of very good points. She said, I did a post on Mary Queen of Scots, and she said, Mary should have locked up John Knox the first time she saw him and thrown away the key. There's just so many errors, and yeah, it's more like, why did you marry? Why did you marry Darnley? What on earth were you thinking? I think is probably what I'd be wanting to say. But she's obviously got swept away with her heart, and
Yeah.
who hasn't done that?
Oh, absolutely. I often talk about I don't know why, but I feel like there isn't enough discussion around how very similar her life, minus having her head cut off, but her grandmother, Margaret Tudor, and Mary Queen of Scots, they actually made very similar mistakes. There's very much, I've always felt like there was this chip off the old block, grandmother to granddaughter. If we look at the decisions they make around men, there's so much that connects them, and I don't feel like it's something that people pick up on very much.
No, I haven't heard that before either. Which just so for people, might be listening and going, oh, what decisions that may not be so familiar. So what are you referring to there?
Well, the fact that, so Margaret's first husband was obviously the King of Scotland. Mary's first husband was eventually King of France. And after their first husbands die, they go on to marry twice more. And in both instances, the men they choose to marry were wholly inappropriate and massively undercut their positions. And in both instances, particularly Margaret's second husband and Mary's second husband, Lord Darnley, very quickly after becoming married, the husbands start to really misbehave. And so there's just this pattern of going with their hearts over their heads. And it's almost comical how alike their stories are. And as I say, it's not something that people pick up on necessarily. And actually, I raised it with Linda Porter, and Linda Porter didn't agree. And she's going to be one of our speakers, so maybe I'll try and convince her otherwise. But if you look at it, I would say that there's a lot that, that Mary really took after her grandmother.
You know what? I was just thinking about going back to thinking about that question that I would ask. I think I'd actually ask her, what's the biggest mistake that you made? I'd like to ask her that at Fotheringhay. What's the biggest mistake? What's the one thing you would do differently? Because there are so many points, aren't there?
Yes.
Things could have been so different if she'd made a different decision, but I wonder which was the one she felt was the most catastrophic.
I think probably Darnley, but
I think Darnley too.
Yeah, but she also maintained her innocence to her dying day, and it would be Mary. I feel like most people accept that she was guilty in the way that we don't with Anne Boleyn, with Catherine Howard to a lesser degree, but Mary Queen of Scots. I suppose maybe it's because there's this whole England versus Scotland thing going on, but we tend to assume that she definitely was guilty, but she went to her grave maintaining that she didn't conspire and that she'd been set up. So it'd be quite interesting if she were in a position where she just had to answer truthfully, to know, okay, were you involved in the plots, or were you framed? That's I suppose the big question.
I tell you the thing I don't blame her for, and that is, I don't blame her for looking to Elizabeth for help. I think that was quite a reasonable thing that she did. I don't think that was an error. I think in many ways, she obviously underestimated some of the politics and the characters surrounding Elizabeth, who would play such an important role in her fate. But I think it was quite a reasonable thing to do, unlike the Darnley incident, for example, where you just left thinking, oh my goodness.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, they were kinswomen, they were related. She was a fellow queen regnant, although, deposed. So I think it would have felt natural to go into England and get her support and hopefully secure Elizabeth's support. But I think she massively misunderstood, the way that she was viewed and how much Protestantism had taken root with Elizabeth's Privy Council and things like that. I think it was all, and also there is that classic thing that Elizabeth was ruled with the head, Mary ruled with the heart. And I think that is what was their biggest difference between the two women. So the tour that we're running is Mary Queen of Scots from Crown to Captivity, and the very nature of the tour is that it takes us through the sort of a very monumental part of Mary's story, which is her childhood right through to her abdication. Now, obviously, there's the window where she's in France we don't cover, but we are starting at Linlithgow Palace, which was where Mary was born. Sadly, quite a bit of Linlithgow is now gone, but what is there that we're going to be able to see?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite significant ruins. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised and delighted. I mean, it's a beautiful Renaissance style palace. So in some ways, it looks quite out of kilter, for example, with more austere Scottish medieval palaces, for example, at Stirling Castle. It definitely was created in that Renaissance style. And we have a beautiful single courtyard building with the most magnificent, I think it's been restored, but the most magnificent Renaissance style fountain at its centre. It's really quite stunning. And we're lucky in that, although it is in ruins, there are no ceilings. So therefore, there are no elaborate interiors to explore. You can still see the entire four ranges, and you get chance to get up, get into, walk around, and usually you can access the rooms the privy rooms in which Mary of Guise gave birth to Mary. So you can get into those privy chambers. They do still exist. So that's quite exciting. And adjacent to you have the parish church, right adjacent to the palace, which was, I believe, where Mary was baptized. So we also, and again, I think I didn't get a chance to go in. When I was up in Scotland, it was just post-COVID and everything was just opening up, but there were a lot of things that were still closed. So it was slightly frustrating. In fact, I only got into Linlithgow because I was there with a local guide who actually will be joining us. She's a Linlithgow resident and a guide who has devoted a lot of her time on Mary, Queen of Scots. And she was with me, and we managed to blag our way into an otherwise deserted Linlithgow Palace. So I was very lucky that I actually got in at all, but the church was closed, so I didn't get to see inside there. But, another really historic spot. So, and of course, you've got the beautiful setting. The palace overlooks the lake, so you really get the sense of drama and the kind of view that Mary of Guise would have enjoyed from her privy apartments there.
Yeah. And also, I mean, it's where Mary's born, but it must also be then where she becomes queen, because Mary, a lot of people may not know, well, some may know, but Mary becomes queen at just 6 days old. So it's almost certain that it was Linlithgow where she was proclaimed queen as well.
Oh, yeah, because she was there for the first few months of her life. I'm trying to remember. I think she moved to Stirling when she was about 6 months old. So she spent those first 6 months at Linlithgow. And of course, that's where her father, James V, visited Mary to see his newborn daughter. I think he was returning from a really catastrophic defeat by English forces. And he was a broken man, but he stopped at Linlithgow to see his daughter, famously lamenting the fact that she was a she, and prophesizing that the whole Stuart dynasty would come to an end with a lass.
Can we alas, little can we alas, or something like
that,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he went off to Falkland, which we'll come to, where he died. And of course, Mary did visit through her adult life, and I think it was on her way from Linlithgow that she was abducted by Bothwell and taken off to his castle at Dunbar, where he, we think, raped her, and she obviously was then forced to marry him. Another one of the tragedies of her life. So yeah, beautiful spot. I like Linlithgow very much because of its architecture. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to going. I mean, that's the other thing for me as well, is that I haven't been to any of the places we're going to, save Edinburgh Castle. So I'm just thrilled to be seeing loads of places that I've never gone to. So I'm very really excited about this tour for that reason alone. But we're going to be heading to Stirling Castle. Now, Stirling is much more, it's Scottish. It feels medieval. It's this big medieval castle. What can you tell me about the history of Stirling?
So yes, so Stirling Castle is quite stunning in that it sits perched up on this plateau of rock, and it's the gateway to the Highlands and a really important strategic spot. And I think that's why we had the Battle of Stirling Bridge there with William Wallace. And in fact, you've got the Wallace Monument that kind of overlooks the town of Stirling and overlooks the castle and gives you quite spectacular views of the kind of the whole panorama of the area. But yeah, it's very much your sort of medieval castle, but it's got a bit of a different feel to it as well. The Great Hall and the chapel. The chapel is a later version. It's not the original. Of course, Mary, Queen of Scots, we should say, was taken from Linlithgow by her mother when she was, I think it was 6 months old. This was on account of the so-called rough wooing by Henry VIII, when he was trying to create that alliance between his son Edward and Mary, and little Mary. And Mary of Guise was not too keen on the idea, although there were a lot of empty words, but not much action, I think, happened. But what did happen was that Mary, Queen of Scots, was taken to Stirling to get her further into the heartland of Scotland, further away from the English border. And she spent, I think, the first sort of most of the first sort of 4 or 5 years of her life there before she left for France.
Yeah. And it's also where at 9 months she was crowned, wasn't she, at Stirling?
She was crowned at Stirling in the chapel there. As I was going on to mention, the chapel that is there now is a later replacement. So unfortunately, you don't see kind of the original chapel that Mary would have been crowned in. But nevertheless, it's roughly on the same footprint. But there's also a rather stunning Great Hall. And if I remember the story rightly, it's very similar to, I think it's Eltham Palace, because the Scottish ambassadors had been down to Eltham and seen the kind of great halls of Henry's palaces, and so came back and aped the design. It got sort of incorporated into the design there. So rather stunning Great Hall. And then the other thing to note is one of the really, I think, great things for visitors is that some years back, Historic Environment Scotland, who look after Stirling Castle, recreated the entire kind of flow of privy chambers in the style of the 16th century. So you don't have to imagine very much. You've got the dressings, the interiors, the colours, and going right the way through into what would have been kind of Mary's private chamber, bed chamber. So I love that kind of thing, because it's lovely to imagine, but it's lovely actually to see it recreated as well.
Yeah. And I think the fact that she's crowned there is obviously quite a considerable thing. And actually, her father and her son would also be crowned there rather than in Edinburgh. They were both, that's where both James V and James VI were also crowned in the chapel at Stirling. So there's obviously it was obviously very, very important to the Scottish monarchy.
Yeah, I think so. Very, very central castle for them. And again, we've got later when Mary comes back to England. Of course, she visits Stirling regularly, and I think it's at Stirling that she nurses Darnley back to health. Not too long after she meets him, he falls ill, and she personally attends him at his bedside. And I think that's when people kind of realise that it's more than just a passing friendship going on here. And that was I think it was not too long after that they married.
So another spot that we're going to be visiting, that you briefly mentioned a moment ago, is Falkland Palace. Now, this was, I believe, quite a favoured spot of Mary's. It's where she was able to... Is Falkland where she played tennis?
Yeah, so it was like more like a hunting lodge, but it was a bit more than a lodge. I have to say again, I fell victim to the fact that the actual building itself wasn't open, but I managed to get a guide to get us in and have a look around the gardens and enjoy the exteriors of the palace. And I'm really excited about going back because it is described as a Renaissance palace. So it's really quite stunning, not least because of its location. It was a pleasure palace, which means it's away from the city. It's surrounded by really beautiful, stunning countryside. And it's in the centre of a tiny little town. And in fact,
Mm,
people who've watched Outlander and the first series of Outlander will recognize it immediately, because the scenes where Claire first arrives in Scotland and they gosh, it's a while since I watched Outlander, but they check into the local hotel there. And that's where she sees, I think, the ghosts of Jamie outside of her window, and that's all in Falkland. And so
right.
it's a really quaint little village. And then you have this massive, beautiful palace with some gorgeous Renaissance architecture. And so there is a range of that palace that you can explore. I think including the chapel. I'm really excited because that will be my first time going inside there as well.
Mm,
You have another range which I think contained the privy apartments. I know, for example, that that's where Mary's father died in one of those rooms, and
right.
you've just got kind of the ruins of that. But yes, there's a 16th century tennis court where Mary played her real tennis. So again, I'm afraid I didn't get in to see that, but so I have got stuff I'm really looking forward to as well, seeing for the first time. So you're not alone, Adam.
Yeah, you mentioned there that this was a pleasure palace, really, and it dawned on me that we're focusing. This tour is primarily structured around Stirling and Edinburgh as our sort of our bases. But when I was looking at this, there appear to be a lot of castles and palaces in quite a concentrated area of Scotland. Now, this I suppose is similar to London in the at the time. You had Greenwich, you had Whitehall, you had further on the outskirts Richmond and Hampton Court and so on. So of the places we're visiting, which were the more official, I suppose, places versus the pleasure palaces?
I mean, they're all royal palaces,
Mm,
but I think you have to look for Stirling and really for Edinburgh to
yeah.
be principal seats, with your likes of your Holyrood and your Edinburgh Castle and your Stirling Castle. They seem to feature most prominently in the 16th century story. But I would emphasize, you're quite right, there's so many places that Mary went to. Whenever I speak to anybody who is Scottish, who's aware of Mary's travels, one of the first things they always say to me is, Mary went everywhere. She was always traveling around Scotland.
Mm,
But the big palaces, the kind of state palaces, I suppose, we are definitely looking at Edinburgh and Stirling.
yeah. We're going to be taking a walk along the Royal Mile and visiting St Giles Cathedral. So you touched earlier actually about John Knox and the mistake that Mary maybe had in not arresting him. So how does this portion of the Royal Mile, St Giles, etc., how does that come into the story?
So, yeah, I mean, I suppose most famously because of John Knox, who was that Protestant, hardline Protestant preacher who hated Mary and was a
Hated women, really.
oh, he hated women. Yes, he
Yeah.
absolutely hated women, but he hated women, Mary particularly, because she was a woman who was a queen, and a Catholic
Yeah.
queen at that. No good could come of this, diabolical turn of events. And
Mm,
he preached relentlessly against her. And he was a minister at St Giles and did much of his preaching there. So I think that's why we associate him with that particular building. I
yeah.
understand Mary never went in St Giles's Cathedral because it was Protestant. She obviously certainly had her encounters with John
Mm.
Knox. And it's also interesting to say that there is a tomb there that's interesting to go and see, and that's of Mary's half brother James Stewart, who was
Okay.
regent on behalf of Mary's infant son once Mary had abdicated. He was actually assassinated at Linlithgow, actually in the town of Linlithgow, in 1570. But his funeral and his body was interred at St Giles's Cathedral. And I think I'm right in saying that John Knox was sort of officiated at that ceremony. So we
I
would
see.
be able to see that tomb, which obviously he's quite a central player in Mary's
Yeah.
story.
Yeah. And what specifically is the Royal Mile in Edinburgh?
It's a road that connects, essentially, it runs between, it's the heart of Edinburgh, and it runs between Edinburgh Castle, which sits kind of high up,
Mm,
and then it is a gentle descent downhill all the way to the bottom of the Royal Mile, which is Holyrood. So royal, I guess, because it's connecting two
too.
royal palaces. Mile, I imagine, because it's about a mile long, although I haven't measured it myself.
Well, that's what we're going to be doing that walk on the tour anyway. So we're going to be able to see how it connects these two major castles and palaces in the heart of Edinburgh.
Yeah, and it's got a feeling of being quite a small. I mean, most old towns haven't they? Usually in cities these days, you've got the sprawling outer city of modernity.
Mm,
Very often you will find an old part of a city, and that's not uncommon. And Edinburgh's got quite a cozy feel to it when you get in right into the centre. And
yeah,
since the Royal Mile is a straight road connecting one to the other, it's very easy to get around. You can't really get lost.
yeah. And obviously, we're going to be going to Edinburgh Castle whilst I mean, it would be no visit to Scotland would be complete without a visit to Edinburgh Castle. So you said a moment ago that this was alongside Stirling. This is sort of Royal HQ. I suppose the other thing about Edinburgh Castle is that maybe unlike some of the other places we're going to, this is very much a building that's still packed full of amazing artifacts, furniture. It's full, right? There's a lot to see and do.
Yeah, and I think, the highlight in terms of the actual spaces is Mary's privy apartment, her privy chamber.
Mm,
And just off that privy chamber, you have this tiny little closet, which is where Mary gave birth to the future James the Sixth of Scotland, first of England. And I always think it's really moving when you step into a small space, because you know that person was in that small space. You were standing where they stood. There's no guesswork in
mm.
that. And I think that's probably the highlight for in terms of the spaces when you visit Edinburgh. I mean, obviously, there's a lot to see there. There's centuries of history to peel back. And as you mentioned, there's some really interesting artifacts, which again, I was a victim of COVID, so I didn't get to see the crown jewels, which are held at Edinburgh Castle. And,
Yes.
the important thing about the crown jewels is that crown is the crown that was used to crown, that was the crown that Mary knew. I think it's the oldest crown in the British Isles because, of course, the English crown jewels predominantly date to after the Civil War in the 17th century. But this is a genuine 16th century artifact. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that. And that's got to be a highlight, hasn't it? A
Oh,
bit of
totally.
bling.
Yeah, I can't wait. I mean, that's for us historians, Oliver Cromwell is a no good bastard, really, for us, isn't he?
No other way to put it.
In in how much he robbed us of. The original crown jewels dated back to the ninth, 10th, 11th century. And I mean, there's now basically just the spoon, I think, is pretty much the only thing in the English
Yeah.
crown jewels that we still have. So to see the Scottish ones is going to. I'm so excited, and I don't think that the Stone of Scone or the Stone of Destiny is on display anymore.
No,
Unfortunately,
it's elsewhere. It's somewhere
yeah.
else. I can't remember where it is, but it is elsewhere, and it's not at Edinburgh. So no, that won't be one of the artifacts that we're seeing, sadly.
So we're also going to be visiting the Palace of Holyroodhouse, which remains actually it's the official residence of the monarch when they're in Scotland to this day. I think people tend to assume that it's Balmoral, don't they? But
Yeah, yeah,
Balmoral is a
yeah.
private residence.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the royal family the king and queen do go to Scotland for a set week, I think it is, every
Mm.
year. They're in residence there. So yeah, it's a working royal palace. But thankfully and you do get to tour around, of course, quite a bit of the palace, but thankfully, again, we've got the tower which contained Mary's private apartments, which is if you wanted any part of Holyrood to survive, that would be the bit that you would want, particularly because, we have the horrendous, bloody murder of David
Mm.
Rizzio in front of Mary's eyes. And you get to stand, you see the alcove where Mary was dining, the staircase that the murderers came up. You can so vividly imagine the events because it's not a huge space.
Hmm.
Again, it's not a huge space, and you can go and visit the room next door. The room next door is full of artifacts associated with Renaissance, 16th century Scotland, with Mary and her reign. There's some lovely portraits and pieces of jewellery. The Lennox jewel is there, which is just stunning. But you also get to see the place where David Rizzio was stabbed to death. And there's a red stain on the floor. I don't know whether that's a real stain or whether somebody just nips out there every couple of weeks and just rubs a little bit of red
Bit of red paint on the floor.
Yeah, who be it from me to, say.
Cast aspersions on the royal family.
Yeah, but there is a plaque there that tells you this is the spot where the poor guy was stabbed multiple times. It's such a good story. I look forward to telling that story because, she has this daredevil escape in a couple of days. I think she gets lowered out of a window. It's really, it's really quite amazing. I mean, it's everything you need from a dramatic story.
Yeah. Oh, there's these midnight flits that you get in history are fascinating. I've always loved the one. I don't know whether you know the one of Empress Matilda back in the 12th century. She escaped in the middle of a snowstorm by wearing a big white cloak.
Blending in.
Yeah, I love those sorts of stories. On the Palace of Holyroodhouse, and if you don't know the answer, don't worry, but it doesn't look as old. Where medieval castles and palaces don't tend to be very symmetrical, Holyrood is very symmetrical. It doesn't look as old. Is that because a lot of it was actually built later, and parts are lost, or?
Yeah, I'm trying to dredge this up from my memory. I did a blog on Holyrood where I've actually got the floor plans and a detailed description of how it developed over time, and it definitely has developed over time, and it's continued to be used. As you imagine, some of the exterior elements as well as the interiors have been changed quite significantly. But luckily, that particular tower, which contains Mary's apartments, hasn't been changed as far as I'm aware, or not significantly. So we're blessed that is authentic. But yes, it definitely has evolved over time.
Yeah, it's unlike everywhere else we're going. It's still a working palace. It's the same as Buckingham Palace. It's the same as Windsor Castle. And I think that's also, I remember when the Queen died, it was Holyrood Palace where her body lay in state when she was in Scotland. There was that, I don't know if you can recall, there was that famous moment of her body being taken in and seeing Princess Anne curtsy. Yeah. And that's why Holyrood was used rather than Edinburgh Castle or Balmoral, because it's the seat of the monarchy.
Yeah, I remember now. I'd actually forgotten about that bit, but yes, now you mention it, I recall.
So one of the places that we're also visiting, and I think, is this the one you've not been to, which is Craigmillar Castle?
Yeah, Craigmillar, I really don't. I mean, it's in Edinburgh. It's not far away from the centre of Edinburgh. So it was kind of a bit of a no-brainer to include it. And there's, again, substantial ruins there, but I have not visited. But it does play a significant part in Mary's story in that if memory serves you correctly, she retreats there for a period of time following what has been an incredibly difficult year, the murder of Rizzio, then a very difficult birth. I think she's absolutely exhausted, and she has friends there at the castle, and she stays and spends some time probably just resting and convalescing away from the press of the court.
Yeah.
There's other dramatic events go on there, aren't there?
Yeah, well, there's also, that's where it's the base of operations, essentially, for planning Darnley's assassination. Now, how much of that is going to be, like, whether we know the exact location within Craigmillar Castle, I'm sure we'll find out whilst we're on tour, but I do know that is where that was where the plot was hatched. And if Mary spent a lot of time there, then maybe that would lend credence to the theory that she was semi-involved. Who knows?
Yeah, there's definitely, I think, nobody knows. Nobody knows whether, her lords plotted secretly while she, rested elsewhere in the castle, or whether she was involved. I don't think anybody really knows. Well, nobody does really know.
So we're also going to be visiting and I'm really looking forward to this. We're going to the National Museum of Scotland, and we're getting a tour from Dr. Anna Groundwater, who's one of the curators. Have you been to the museum before?
No, I haven't. No. So
okay.
No, there's some great artifacts, including the beautiful silver casket, which is thought to have belonged to Mary. I think it's one of the kind of premier treasures
Yeah, there's a
historic
few
treasures of
things.
Scotland.
Yeah, there's the silver casket. You've also got quite a few coins. You've got items that belonged to Mary of Guise, and there's also a life-size replica of Mary Queen of Scots' tomb from Westminster Abbey. So those in Scotland can also see what the version in London looks like. So that'd be really exciting.
Yeah, yeah, and I think to have Anna be our guide will be fantastic because, as chief curator, there's going to be nobody better than to show us around and point out all the little details that we need to know and answer all of our questions,
Yeah.
which I'm sure there'll be many.
Yes. And on that topic, probably worth us also having a chat about some of the people we're going to be meeting along the way as well. So we're very honoured to be welcoming Dr. Anna Turnham on as our historian in residence as part of the tour. And her knowledge about, Scottish history is going to be amazing. So she's going to be a big feature of the tour going forward.
It's really important that we have somebody who has studied in detail Scottish history. And Anna, I think, particularly specialises in Anglo-Scottish diplomacy during this particular period. So it will be absolutely fantastic to have her on hand the whole time.
Yeah.
Again, to kind of fill in the gaps. And, we're going to, I think, one of the things we want to do, apart from tell the story, so we're really keen on linking the places and creating a really strong story as we go, but we're also going to be leaning into her knowledge to help us understand the who's who at the Stuart court, who were all those key players, and helping us really orientate ourselves.
Yeah, well, there's also that much wider thing around the Scottish, not only the Scottish nobility, but how the clans, for example, interacted. They were such a big part. That is one of the things I do know is that the clans were a very big part of Scottish culture as well. And that's quite different to England. So I'm looking forward to learning more about that and how that also played a part.
Yeah, I really don't know. So it'd be revelatory. So I'm looking forward to that too.
Yeah, and we've got Dr. Linda Porter as well coming along, who's going to be giving us a talk, and she obviously needs no introduction, but that's going to be really fun to hear from her as well.
Yeah, it's going to be, I think we're going to be well supported. There's going to be a fantastic cast of experts for people to really hopefully dive as deep as they want to dive. And, because we know that, people love the details and want the details, and these are the people who are going to be able to provide that because they've just got such a wealth of expertise behind them.
The end of the tour, the last significant place we visit is Lochleven Castle, which you referenced a couple of times. From a experience perspective, I suppose this one is quite nice because it's actually on a loch, so we're going to have to travel by boat to get to it.
Yeah, I can't wait. Yeah, again, I didn't do that. The boats weren't running. It was too close to COVID. Mary was taken across the loch after she was taken prisoner at the Battle of Carberry Hill, and she was in Edinburgh for a short period of time before they moved her under the cover of night to Lochleven. Poor woman was utterly exhausted and tragically miscarried of twins shortly after.
Yeah.
She was very unwell. I think she spent about a year on the island. There was one failed plot to rescue her. Of course, during that time, there was she was harassed and harangued and eventually forced, tearfully, she was forced to sign her abdication away to her infant son. But, her ultimate escape is, again, it's such a romantic story because there's this young lad who clearly takes a shine to her. And he manages, I think, I'm trying to remember the details. I think he gets he waits till people get quite drunk over dinner and then manages to steal the keys and get her across the loch safely where horses, from her allies are waiting to take her away. Yeah. And you kind of think at that point there should be a happy ending.
Yeah,
exactly. But so in this, small little island, again, beautiful because you're on the water. I think to kind of be being rowed or to be traveling across the water, remembering these events will be quite something.
Yeah. And what is there at the moment? So the Lochleven Castle now, was there a lot more to it at one point?
I mean, it was never huge, but
Okay.
it is in ruins. But there was a couple of towers. One I think has disappeared, and there was, if I remember rightly from when I was writing, because again I wrote a blog about Loch Leven shortly after I came back. I
Mm.
think there was one tower that no longer exists, but there's another central square tower, and I think much of that exists. But remember, I actually haven't yet been over to it. That principally, and Mary definitely spent time there. So yeah, it's not like we're just going to look at a few stones in the ground.
Yeah.
There is more to it than that.
Yeah. And
And I
it's
think that makes it's kind of the icing on the cake for me.
Yeah, and it's the significance of what happened there. This is where she's forced to abdicate, and then it's where she flees from. As you say, she does this midnight flit, traveling into England with the hope that she's going to throw herself on the mercy of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth, and then it all goes very wrong, pretty
Yeah.
much straight
Yeah.
away. Yeah, remarkable figure, really. I mean, one of the things that I take it, she was 6 foot tall,
Yes, yes, she was a
which
very statuesque woman,
Yeah,
wasn't
I mean
she?
that was a good height for a man at the time. So for a woman, she must have been quite an imposing figure, I think.
Yeah. And I can't remember how tall was Elizabeth. Do we know? We must know.
I think she was about 5'7",
Okay,
five
so
six,
not
five
short
seven.
either, when an average woman was about 5'3", but still
Yeah.
Mary had a few inches on her, which she wouldn't have liked.
Well, I remember, and I referenced. I don't know if you can remember on our tour last September when we were hosting that dinner in the Great Hall at Hever Castle, and we had our Henry comparing heights with one of our tour
Yeah,
participants,
it was
and
funny.
Tyler, and who was taller than Henry, and Henry didn't like this, and I said, well, then he's too tall, and
Yes,
I was very much channeling Elizabeth
you
because
were. You were.
the story. There is a story that Elizabeth was probing the Scottish ambassador to discover who was the taller, who was the more beautiful, who was the more accomplished, and he said that Mary was taller than Elizabeth, and Elizabeth said, "Well, then she is too high, for I am neither short nor high, but of perfect proportions." Or some, I'm paraphrasing, but that's what she said, and I used that in that moment to try and diffuse
The tension.
the tension. Like all of our tours, what I suppose, again, what makes these things special is that it's not just going from place to place, but it's peppering it with the guest speakers. It's the nice experiences that we have along the way. We're going to be doing a beautiful whiskey tasting experience, for example. We're doing that boat trip over to Loch Leven. So for you, what is the sort of the thing you're most excited about, I think, for people to experience whilst they're on tour with us?
Oh my goodness me. Oh, it's so difficult because it depends what really, excites you. I think the most profound spot is her apartments in Holyrood because it's
Mhm.
so dramatic.
Yeah,
And it's so awful what she had to experience there. Um, but I think that the boat crossing across Loch Leven will be charming and romantic,
yeah.
and therein is encapsulated Mary's story, the kind of the bittersweet romanticism and poignancy of the whole thing.
Yeah. And also just I think the fact that a bit like our 1502 tour that we're doing next July, this is a tour where it's very probable that a lot of people won't have been to any of the places we're going to. So that's also going to be really nice, is the ability to, yeah, show people round and for us experience places that well, I've certainly not been to many of, which is also going to be really lovely.
Yeah, yeah, we're gonna be lapping it up alongside a slice of Scottish life, as you say, and
Ah,
there might be one or two other surprises we managed to concoct between then and now, but people will have to stay tuned for that.
yes. And I need to inquire as to whether there are non-alcoholic whiskies for you to sup.
Non-alcoholic anything, yeah. I won't be. Yeah, I won't be. I'm going on a whiskey tasting evening, but I'm not actually tasting any whiskey.
I adore whiskey, so I'm very much looking forward to
Oh,
that.
you can have mine. You can have mine, Adam.
I'll double up.
I'll donate them to you.
Well, thank you very much for coming back on for a chat. This has been really fun, and hopefully people will, be inspired to discover more. And for those who do want to keep up to date with what we do, where should they head to?
Oh, simplytudortours.com, which is our website, and there you'll find our tour page. So you'll see all the latest tours that are currently booking. And of course, Mary is very recently opened. The only other tour we have one spot available on is our 1502, the year that shook the Tudor throne, following in the footsteps of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. So those are the two currently open, but we hopefully will be bringing another one online, an Anne Boleyn-centric tour later in the year.
Yes. And what else have you got going on at the moment, if you're happy to say?
Oh my God, going on. Well, I think Simply Tudor Tours is really taking over my life, really.
Yes.
No, I don't know whether people know, but actually I don't just do this. I'm actually a 23 years as a executive coach, and I am busy. So I have my coaching business, and I'm busy creating the very first retreat that I've ever run. So that's happening in June. So I flit between these two worlds of creating midlife warrior retreats for midlife folk looking to thrive in the second half of life. And then the next minute, I'm in Mary Queen of Scots world or Henry VIII's world, either writing. I have my blog, of course, the Tudor Travel Guide, and I'm regularly adding new and detailed content. And as you say, Adam, it's stories of people and places told, of people and events told through the lens of places. Yeah. And I've just finished a whole series on Thomas Cromwell, and constantly adding stuff there. And I've got my own podcast, which is the Tudor History and Travel Show, where you find me out and about, roaming across England, visiting historic places, teaming up with local guides and experts, and unpacking the stories of these folks. So in fact, I'm off to Hatfield House tomorrow morning to do a podcast there. And I'm really looking forward to that because I think I've got the palace to myself, which is great.
How lovely. Busy lady. I'm looking forward to this. We've got our next tour coming up in a few weeks' time. Anne and Elizabeth, mother, daughters, traitors, queens, which is going to be fascinating as well. But yeah, thank you so much again for coming on to have a chat. And we will no doubt speak several more times today before
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. My thanks to Sarah for joining me on the show, and my thanks to you for listening to the podcast each week. To keep up to date with all things Tudor Chess, please head over to my Instagram account. Please feel free to send me a message on there. If you have any podcast topics or guest suggestions, I would love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess Podcast, and see you next week.